Overcrowded boats, smugglers, washed up life jackets, drownings, huge metal fences, borders, a desperate search for safety. I doubt there's a single person in this room that doesn't know what I'm talking about when I say these words. With 65 million people displaced globally, going to ever greater lengths to leave behind war and persecution in their home country, it is impossible for any of us to ignore what is taking place. News reports, photos, and stories reach us daily, documenting the terrifying journeys that people are taking. Yet no matter how many times we see a photo of a body washed up on the shore, or hear of a person dying as they fall from the underside of a lorry, it is never enough to convey the sheer horror of what is taking place.
Disbelieving authorities, confusion, indefinite detention, isolation, long-term unemployment, destitution. I wonder how many people in the room know what I'm talking about when I say these words, however. This is the part of the story that is told far less often, the reality that people face when they arrive to the UK to seek asylum. Although many people do not know it, refugees often face years more suffering at the hands of our own asylum process. Their journey is not over just because their feet are finally on British soil.
Eve left Eritrea 6 years ago. No longer able to cope with the physical and emotional abuse at the hands of her husband and other perpetrators in her country, she decided to flee. Without getting access to her own identity papers because her husband had hidden them, Eve had to leave without them. She got hold of any money that she could and contacted a smuggler to help her get out. Smugglers, or agents as they are known, often do not tell people that are fleeing their home country where they will end up. In Eve's case, she only knew that she was coming to the UK when she came close to British shores.
When she arrived, she went straight to the asylum screening unit in Croydon, which is where the majority of asylum claims are processed in the UK. She explained to the man behind the glass screen that she was fleeing Eritrea for fear of her life and for fear of her husband, but she was told that he didn't believe her, and she was made to leave. This was the first of many times that Eve was made to feel like she was lying. With no money and no friends in London, she was forced to walk the streets and shelter in bus stops all night until she could return to the centre the next morning. She was cold, and she was scared, and she was confused. The next morning, a member of staff arrived to find her waiting outside at 5 a.m. and let her in, this time allowing her to process her claim. Shortly after doing so, Eve was told that she was going to be detained.
Detention takes place when the UK Border Agency decide that there is a straightforward case for somebody to be refused asylum. Detention centres are like prisons, without a release date and without a sentence. Many people like Eve, whose only crime is to seek asylum, can be detained indefinitely. The UK is the only country in Europe that can detain asylum seekers for an indefinite period of time.
Eve was taken to Yarl's Wood, where she was put in a cell with a woman who didn't share her language, and she was told to wait. She wasn't told how long she'd be waiting for or what was going to happen to her next. She was served food that wasn't properly cooked, so she became unwell, and she didn't feel comfortable asking the guards, most of whom were male, for sanitary wear, so she went without. After a couple of weeks, Eve was finally given her substantive interview for asylum, her final chance to convince the Home Office that her life would be in danger if she returned to Eritrea. A couple of days later, she received her decision. Eve, like 3/4 of women who applied for asylum that year, had been refused. Yet again, her story had been discredited.
At this point, many people who were refused asylum are returned to their home country. This would have been Eve's fate too, if she didn't have the ability to use email and fax, or have a good level of English that many asylum seekers don't have when they first arrive into the UK.
She managed to contact a lawyer and a friend in Eritrea who was able to get hold of some of her documents and send them to her, and this helped her to prove that elements of her case were in fact true. After months more turmoil fighting her claim from inside Yarl's Wood, Eve was finally granted refugee status, and the Home Office retracted their original decision.
As horrendous as Eve's story is, Eve was in fact one of the lucky ones. Most people that are refused asylum are either deported straight away or spend years fighting with the courts to get their decision overturned. This is the case for many of the women that Bread and Roses work with. During this time that they are waiting for their refugee status, they do not have the right to work and live off less than £5 a day. As a result of this, many women and men are at risk of exploitation and destitution. Most of the women that we have met have been waiting for over 10 years before they get a final decision on their refugee status. Throughout this process, they are subjected to much of the hostility, the suspicion, and the disbelief that Eve's story gives just a glimpse of.
If you feel a bit overwhelmed listening to these stories, then we know how you feel. It's sad, and it's frustrating, and it's hard to get your head around it. So much of the shitty stuff that happens to these women when they come to the UK feels out of our control. We're not border agency staff or senior civil servants in the Home Office. Listening to Eve's story makes us feel an exaggerated sense of what most of us already feel on a daily basis, which is, in the grand scheme of things, we're pretty powerless.
But feeling powerless doesn't feel like a good enough excuse to not do anything. We don't know how to fix any of the big, complex, systemic stuff, but we do know how these women's experiences have made them feel. The abuse that they have suffered at the hands of the perpetrators in their home country has made them feel illegitimate. The treatment by the UK authorities when they come to our country has made them feel illegitimate. And living in destitution without the power to change their fate has made them feel illegitimate.
Whilst we'll never be able to understand the experiences that these women have been through, I think to some extent we can identify with that feeling of illegitimacy. To a much lesser degree, when you receive a promotion at work, or you start a new job, or you're asked to stand on stage and deliver a talk, we've all at some point or another felt like we're not good enough to be where we are. And when we suffer these crises of confidence and our self-esteem is running really low, the thing that often makes the difference is knowing that someone believes in us.
Bread and Roses was set up with this at the forefront of our mind. Knowing as we did that women have come to feel worthless, we wanted to do something, even if it was something small, to try and restore that sense of self-worth. We knew the phrase, "the worker must have bread, but she must have roses too," and this really resonated with us. The idea that women with very little deserve not only the basics, but also the opportunity to have pleasure and beauty felt very relevant to the women that we'd met. We'd seen the basic services available. They were functional, but there was no beauty.
So we drew inspiration from our name and decided to invite some of these women to a floristry workshop. When they arrived, there was almost a sense of suspicion amongst some of the women. It was as though they couldn't believe that the reason the room was filled with beautiful flowers was simply for them. As we started snipping stems and chatting over cups of tea, everyone started to relax and to enjoy what we were doing. And since then, we've run many floristry workshops with many women around London. And what we've seen is this. If you invite a woman into a group and give her the opportunity to create something of her own, something beautiful, then you can, in some small way, help her to start restoring a bit of that self-worth.
You could be forgiven for everything that we've said, that the women we work with are defeated. But that couldn't be further from the truth. despite being discredited and degraded for so long. The women that we've come to know are strong and they're resilient. Like Jane, who's been coming to our workshops for a number of weeks and is full of love and laughter. And it's easy to forget that she's been waiting in the UK for 8 years and still hasn't got her refugee status. When we first met her, we didn't realize that what appeared to be an insatiable appetite for biscuits was in fact a result of being dependent on food banks. The very act of carrying on when the system is so stacked against them is itself an act of defiance.
We now run programs in partnership with refugee organisations around London. Beyond the simple act of offering something beautiful, our floristry workshops serve for women to build the foundations of self-confidence and self-belief, which are necessary if they're to start thinking about integrating into their communities or applying for work. For those women who do have the right to work, we supplement our floristry workshops with an employability program. And we have been so inspired by the women who've passed through our program and are now in paid or voluntary employment.
What we do isn't groundbreaking and it isn't revolutionary, but it has taught us that we don't need to feel powerless in the face of systemic injustice. Challenging what we don't believe in and standing up for what we do doesn't need a fully formed plan. It can begin with simple gestures of humanity, simple gestures of solidarity, and that is something that we are all capable of. Thank you.